The voicemail arrived at 11:51 on a Tuesday night. Brooke. Paige is marrying into the Foster family this weekend. Their background check flagged an unregistered dependent. So we need you in Greenwich by Friday. Tell them you were away at a private boarding school in Switzerland. Just look close for the wedding album. And once the reception is over, we can all go back to our lives. 23 years of absolute silence, compressed into 22 seconds of audio. The last time Patricia used that brisk, managing tone with me, I was 6 years old, gripping a cracked yellow suitcase on our front porch. Gregory had patted my shoulder, promised they would pick me up from Aunt Catherine's before school started in the fall, and backed the sedan down the driveway. A cloud of gray exhaust hung in the summer air. They never turned the car around. I tapped the screen once. The audio cut out. The lakefront skyline outside my office window reflected a woman with steady hands and a level pulse. I snapped the laptop shut, pulled a small steel lockbox from the bottom desk drawer, and set it inside my overnight bag. They wanted an older sister for their high society photo album. I was bringing them the receipts. I am 29 years old now. I built a logistics technology startup from a folding table in a studio apartment into a company operating out of a glass tower in Chicago. Last year, my face was on the cover of Forbes. My parents love that detail. They respect success, especially when it comes with a high valuation. What they refuse to acknowledge is the 23-year gap between the humid afternoon they dropped me off at Aunt Catherine's and the morning my company made national news. They told me they were out of money. They swore it was just a temporary fix until Gregory got back on his feet. 6 months after my one-way trip, Gregory bought a sprawling house in a gated subdivision. Patricia enrolled my 4-year-old sister, Paige, in an elite private preparatory academy. They joined the local country club. My old bedroom was painted blush pink and converted into a walk-in closet for Paige's expanding wardrobe. They never ran out of money. They simply ran out of the desire to fund 2 lives. They looked at their finances and decided they only wanted to afford one perfect child. Aunt Catherine tried to call them. They let the phone ring. I spent my 7th, 8th, and 9th birthdays making handmade cards for my mother and father out of construction paper. Catherine mailed every single one. Patricia intercepted them at the mailbox. She dumped them straight into the kitchen trash can, right under the coffee grounds. Before Paige could ever see them, that was the first wall of her lie. The second wall was what she carefully constructed inside Paige's head. Patricia sat my little sister down and spun a tragic story about a rebellious, angry older sister who hated her family and begged to live with her wealthy aunt. Paige grew up believing I abandoned her. I grew up discarded. 2 sisters, separated by a meticulously crafted fiction, designed entirely to keep Patricia's hands clean. There is a terrifyingly simple mental trick to locking a child out of your life and still sleeping peacefully at night. Patricia could not face the monstrous reality of her own choices. To survive the guilt, she had to rewrite the narrative. She convinced herself that I preferred Catherine's quiet house over her chaotic one. She told herself that keeping me away was actually an act of love. A heavy sacrifice she endured to ensure Paige had a stable childhood. By repeating that lie every single day, the abandonment transformed into a noble burden. She anointed herself the victim of a fractured family, perfectly masking the fact that she was the architect who tore it down. That delusion held strong for over 2 decades. It would have lasted forever. Except Paige got engaged to Spencer Foster. The Fosters are Greenwich royalty. They operate on pedigree, legacy, and reputation. When they decided to merge their charitable trust with Paige's future assets, their lawyers ran a standard, comprehensive background check. A forgotten, discarded older daughter suddenly appeared on the paperwork. Patricia panicked. Her sudden desperation had nothing to do with missing her eldest child. She was terrified of losing her front row seat to a billionaire wedding. She needed me to play the role of a polished, boarding school educated sister to prove to the Fosters that she was a flawless mother. Greenwich, Connecticut. Smells like old money and manicured boxwoods. The rehearsal dinner took place in the private dining room of a country club that required a generational pedigree just to walk through the front doors. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. Waiters in white gloves floated between the tables, pouring champagne that cost more than my first car. I wore a simple navy dress. No flashy jewelry. Just the clothes on my back and the small bag resting on my shoulder. I walked into the room, and Patricia immediately intercepted me. Her grip clamped around my forearm. Her acrylic nails dug into my skin through the fabric. She flashed a brilliant, camera-ready smile and dragged me toward the head table. The Fosters sat there, draped in tailored suits and polite, polished expressions. Patricia introduced me as her prodigal daughter, returned from the corporate battlefield to celebrate her baby sister. Halfway through the second course, Patricia tapped her silver fork against her crystal flute. The low hum of conversation faded out. She stood up, smoothing the front of her emerald silk dress, and beamed at the crowd. She launched into a performance worthy of an award. She talked about love, about sacrifice, about the deep, unbreakable roots of family. Then, she turned her gaze to me. She placed a hand over her heart. A single, perfectly timed tear welled in her eye. She spun a story about our unbreakable sisterly bond. She told a room full of billionaires how difficult it was to send her brilliant, independent, oldest daughter across the ocean for a world-class education. She painted a masterpiece of a family that gave up their own comfort for their children's success. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. I kept my eyes locked directly on her face. A tiny bead of sweat formed right at her hairline. She knew exactly what I was. She knew she had invited a loaded gun to her table. But she banked her entire future on the assumption that the velvet drapes, the expensive silverware, and the crushing weight of high society etiquette would intimidate me into playing her game. The polite applause finally faded. Guests returned to their roasted duck. Spencer's mother leaned across the centerpieces. She had warm eyes and a massive diamond resting against her collarbone. She smiled at me, swirling a splash of red wine in her glass. "Patricia tells us you spent your formative years in Geneva," she said, her tone completely genuine and conversational. "Which Swiss boarding school did you attend?" "Brooke Spencer's cousin is looking at a few programs out there for her son." The ambient noise in the room seemed to evaporate. Patricia turned into a statue. Her wine glass hovered inches from her mouth. Gregory, sitting to my left, suddenly stared at his linen napkin like it held the secrets of the universe. Paige just looked back and forth between us, entirely unaware of the collision about to happen. I set my water glass down on the crisp white tablecloth. The clink of the glass echoed. I looked dead at Patricia. Every drop of color drained from her face. The confident, glowing socialite vanished. A terrified, cornered woman sat in her place. I held her panicked stare for 3 full seconds. Then, I turned my attention back to Spencer's mother. My voice was perfectly level. Quiet. The kind of quiet that cuts through a room like a scalpel. I never went to boarding school. The silence that dropped over the table was heavy enough to crack the marble floor. No one moved. No one took a breath. I reached down into my bag, pulled out the small steel lockbox, and set it right in the center of the table. I popped the latch on the steel lockbox. The lid snapped open. No thick legal binders. No dramatic folders. Just 3 items resting on the black felt. I picked up the first piece of paper and slid it across the white tablecloth, stopping it directly in front of Paige. The edges were yellowed and frayed. My one-way plane ticket to Chicago from 23 years ago. Next to it, I placed a single sheet of heavy legal stock. Gregory's signature sat in stark black ink at the very bottom. A permanent guardianship transfer. Surrendering all parental rights to Catherine. Patricia's chair scraped violently against the marble floor. She lunged forward to sweep the papers away. Paige caught her mother's wrist in midair. She pushed Patricia's hand down and pinned it flat against the table. I pulled my phone from my pocket, set it face up next to the box, and hit play on the voicemail from 3 weeks ago. Patricia's sharp, commanding voice echoed through the silent dining room, instructing me to lie to the Fosters about a Swiss boarding school and play the perfect, polished prop. The audio stopped. The trap snapped shut. Spencer's mother stared at Patricia with pure, unfiltered disgust. Paige stared at the phone. Her breathing turned shallow and fast. She looked up at me. "Mom told me you hated us." Paige whispered. "She said you packed your own bags and begged to leave. She told me you guys could not afford me." I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "She said you were broke. She said I was a financial burden." We looked at each other. Two halves of a 23-year-old lie, finally stitched together in front of the groom's entire family. Patricia sat frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The heavy oak doors at the back of the dining room swung open. Heels clicked rhythmically against the polished floorboards. Aunt Catherine walked right past the stunned waiters. She stopped at the edge of our table, adjusting her silver-rimmed glasses. She dropped a thick manila envelope on top of my lockbox. "They were never broke," Catherine said. Her voice carried the weight of a judge reading a sentence. "Gregory received a massive corporate bonus the very month they shipped Brooke to my house. I offered to pay all of Brooke's living expenses if they just brought her back." Patricia refused in writing. She said having 2 daughters would disrupt Paige's new lifestyle. Gregory finally looked up from his napkin. Sweat beaded heavily on his upper lip. "We tried to bring her back." He mumbled. 12 years ago. "We called you." Catherine. Catherine let out a dry, humorless laugh. She reached into the envelope and pulled out a printed email thread. "You called me because I set up a $400,000 trust fund for Brooke," Catherine said. She slid the email toward Spencer's mother. "Your first question was not how she was doing. Your first question was who controlled the money if she moved back into your house before she turned 18. When I told you the funds were legally locked, you vanished for another decade." Patricia buried her face in her hands. The performance was over. Paige's hands trembled over the table. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Brooke," she said, her voice cracking. "I found you online 3 years ago. I wanted to message you. But Mom threatened to cut my law school tuition if I ever reached out. She expected me to walk around the table. She expected a tearful hug. A complete absolution of guilt." I stood up. I slung my bag over my shoulder. "Mom took 20 years," I said. "But the last 3 were your choice." I turned my back on the table. It walked out through the oak doors and left them sitting in the wreckage. The lobby of the Greenwich Estate Hotel was perfectly quiet the next morning. I walked down the grand staircase holding a paper cup of black coffee. A tight knot of people stood near the concierge desk. Patricia, Gregory, Paige, Spencer, and his wealthy parents. Patricia held a single sheet of printed paper against her chest like a shield. She was weeping. Actual. Perfectly engineered tears rolled down her cheeks. She was spinning a tragic narrative for the billionaires. She claimed the intense pressure of my startup had completely fractured my mind. He told them I was prone to terrifying delusions, deep jealousy, and psychotic breaks. She pressed the paper into the hands of Spencer's mother. It was a therapy intake form from a prominent clinic in Chicago. It detailed a fabricated history of pathological lying and severe mental instability. Patricia played the devastated, protective mother, forced to expose her unstable oldest child to save her youngest daughter's special day. Paige stared at the marble floor, her shoulders trembling. Spencer's mother studied the paper, her brow furrowing. Right as I approached the group, I stepped into the circle. Patricia flinched, bracing for a screaming match. She wanted a hysterical reaction to prove her point. I just took a slow sip of my coffee. I reached out and gently pulled the paper from Spencer's mother's hands. It looked incredibly professional. Crisp, black text. A prominent blue medical logo at the top center. I tapped my index finger against that blue ink. Brightway Clinic, I said, keeping my voice entirely flat. They operate out of the West Loop in Chicago. My company handled their entire digital infrastructure migration. Patricia's jaw twitched. A deep, ugly shade of red crept up her neck. I handed the paper back to Spencer's mother. They retired this specific blue logo 4 years ago. I watched them box up the old letterhead myself. You printed a template off an outdated internet archive. The blood completely vanished from Patricia's face. She opened her mouth, but her rehearsed script dried up. Her eyes darted around the circle. Searching for an ally, she found absolute zero. Spencer's father stepped forward. The polite, high society charm was gone, replaced by freezing disgust. He told Gregory to pack their bags and leave the property immediately. He promised to call security if they lingered for another 10 minutes. Patricia grabbed Gregory's sleeve. Row. Naked panic stretched her features. No one offered them a shred of sympathy. The Fosters turned their backs. More importantly, Paige stepped away from her mother and stood directly next to me. The heavy silence in the lobby suffocated the two of them. They were finally completely erased. The wedding ceremony started precisely at 2 in the afternoon. Aunt Catherine and I sat in the very front row on the bride's side, directly across the aisle. In the prime spot reserved for the parents of the bride sat nothing but empty air. 2 vacant, mahogany chairs. Paige appeared at the end of the aisle in heavy white silk. She walked the long runner entirely alone. She marched right past the vacant spot. She kept her eyes locked entirely on Catherine and me. She squeezed my hand tightly as she passed our pew. For the first time in 23 years, my sister walked toward her real family. The fallout from that morning in the hotel lobby was absolute, and it was entirely public. When you try to con a family that measures their wealth in generations, the retaliation is swift and financially devastating. The Fosters did not just cancel my parents' hotel reservations. Their legal team immediately filed a massive civil suit for fraudulent defamation and the forgery of medical credentials. Patricia and Gregory were forced to hire a defense attorney just to keep themselves out of a state penitentiary. They ultimately settled out of court, draining $75,000 from their savings to cover the Fosters' legal fees and avoid criminal charges. The settlement came with a strict 5-year protective order, prohibiting them from ever contacting the Foster family or stepping foot on any of their properties. But the legal fees were nothing compared to the social execution. Greenwich is a very small, very loud town when it comes to scandal. Word of the forged psychiatric intake forms spread through their country club before the wedding reception even ended. The membership board quietly revoked Patricia and Gregory's status by the end of the month. Gregory's investment firm, terrified of the public relations nightmare of an executive caught fabricating medical records to blackmail his own CEO daughter, forced him into early retirement. They lost their country club. They lost their income. They lost the carefully curated illusion of perfection they had spent 23 years building. They became complete pariahs, exiled to a quiet, shrinking life in a house that was suddenly far too big and entirely empty. 8 months later, the mailroom at my corporate headquarters sent a small, cream-colored envelope up to my office. There was no return address, but I recognized the looping. Elegant, cursive, immediately. It was Patricia. I sliced the envelope open with a silver letter opener. It was a single page, written on cheap, thin paper, a stark contrast to the heavy, embossed stationery she used to favor. She wrote exactly what you would expect a cornered narcissist to write. She said she was aging and her health was failing. She said that she was still my mother. That she had only ever wanted the best for both of her girls. And that family always finds a way to forgive. There was no apology for the 23 years of erasure. There was no accountability for the forged medical records. Just a desperate, hollow attempt to throw a grappling hook back into my life now that she had nothing else left to climb. I read the entire page. My pulse remained perfectly steady. My chest did not tighten. I walked over to the heavy-duty paper shredder sitting in the corner of my office. I fed the letter into the narrow slot. The steel blades caught the cheap paper and chewed it into tiny, unreadable ribbons in less than 3 seconds. I did not write back. I did not call. I just went back to my desk and opened my quarterly financial reports. The silence I gave her was permanent. Peace looks very different than the chaotic, desperate approval I spent my childhood chasing. My life today is quiet. And it is full. Every Sunday morning, Aunt Catherine and I host brunch at my house overlooking the lake. Paige drives in from the suburbs with Spencer. The four of us sit around a massive oak table, drinking strong coffee and eating burnt toast, laughing until our ribs ache. There are no cameras. There are no performances. There is no one calculating the cost of a plate or measuring our worth by how well we photograph. Paige is finally free from the heavy, a suffocating weight of being the golden child. I am free from the shadow of being the discarded one. We are just two sisters, learning how to be a family entirely on our own terms. Catherine sits at the head of the table, exactly where she belongs. She is the woman who actually stayed. If you are listening to this, and you are carrying the heavy, invisible weight of a family that only loves you when you are convenient, I need you to hear this truth. Toxic parents do not abandon you, ignore you, or belittle you because you are flawed. They do it because you are a mirror, reflecting the absolute worst parts of their own character. And they are too cowardly to look at the glass. I learned 3 brutal, beautiful rules from the wreckage of my family. Rule number 1. Blood is a biological fact. Family is a behavioral choice. True loyalty does not require a subscription fee paid in your own dignity. Love is not a transaction. The people who are meant to be in your life will show up for you. And they will never ask you to shrink yourself to make them comfortable. Rule number 2. Closure is an inside job. You will spend your entire life waiting if you expect a sincere apology from someone who believes their own lies. Real closure is not forcing them to admit they were wrong. Closure is waking up one morning and deciding that their opinion no longer dictates your reality. You take your power back the moment you stop asking for their permission to heal. Rule number 3. The loudest person in the room is usually the weakest. True power and absolute justice do not require screaming matches, theatrical tears, or dragging people down into the mud. When you are armed with the undeniable truth, absolute silence is the most terrifying weapon you can yield. You let them speak. You let them spin their lies. And then you place the facts on the table and walk away. Have you ever had to leave an empty chair in your life to finally find peace? If you have ever had to walk away from toxic blood to protect your own sanity, tell me your story in the comments. We read every single one. Because none of us should have to carry that silence alone.